Thursday, March 20th at 7 p.m. at Cynthia Whitaker's yard, affectionately known as Sin Sin. Her address is 196 Northside. Come listen to the issues and solutions that matter to you. We're proven, stable leadership, moving forward with the PPM.
We're moving forward. We're moving forward. We're moving forward. See the light again.
This is the People's Radio Station. Radio Cayman in the Cayman Islands.
Live from Radio Cayman Studio, this is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
Hello and welcome to Money Sense. This is today's host, Adam Butler. I'm the Chief Investment Officer at Resolve Asset Management here in Cayman. And we have a very special guest today in the form of Katy McFarland, who was the former Deputy National Security Advisor under the previous Trump administration and has served under 4 previous presidents. Katy, maybe just give us a little bit of background.
So my name is Katy McFarland, and I was President Trump's Deputy National Security Advisor in his first term, and before that I've had a long career in and out of government in the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administrations. I was a protege and aide to Henry Kissinger in the 1970s and 80s, and in between I was the Fox News national security analyst, so I was on the air on television daily.
Yeah, you actually have had a remarkable career.
Well, I'm very old.
Well, which you'd never be able to tell. I'm not just saying that. I mean, you are one of America's leading foreign policy experts, and so we're very fortunate to have you here. And you did serve under President Trump, I understand.
Yes, in the first administration, and then I've remained close to him and very close to the people who are having the big jobs in his second administration. I must say that I don't want to work 100 hours a week anymore, so I'm going to not go back into government, but I'm very close to the people who are, and I'm very familiar with all the thinking.
Right. I mean, there's more going on in both foreign policy and domestic policy than we've seen happen in, probably several decades.
And happening very quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The pace of change is quite up.
How would you characterize the differences between the foreign policy environment currently that the Trump administration is facing and what he faced in his previous term?
A lot of the same factors are at play, but they've been magnified. The two things that President Trump, I think, that sort of are the core of how he looks at foreign policy are, number one, that the United States is the world's largest market, that other countries need to sell stuff to us a lot more than we need to buy stuff from them. We have alternate sources of just about everything, but any country needs to have access to the American market. Now, that's always been the case, but it's much more so now than it was 8 years ago, because 8 years ago, China was really thriving. Europe was a growing economy. But if you look at today, European economic growth is pretty much flatlined, and China has not yet recovered from COVID. So they have very large and high unemployment, high youth unemployment. So they need to sell they need to export to the United States. So President Trump is a businessman, not as a politician, but primarily as a businessman with that mentality, understands that gives us an enormous amount of leverage, that we can get not just trade leverage with other countries, but we can have real impact on how we want them to deal with us using trade as a negotiating tool. And then the second thing that's changed or gotten bigger is the U.S. energy reserves. So that we, the United States, always knew that you could get oil and natural gas out of rocks. It's called shale rock. But it was never economically feasible. It was dangerous. It was hard. But in the last 15 years, and especially in the last 5 or 6 years, American energy companies realized several things happened. Mostly engineering advances, so that one was called horizontal drilling. So instead of drilling straight down to get the gusher, you could drill straight down and then go horizontally and have access to shale oil and gas. The second thing was hydraulic fracturing, which is how do you crack a rock and get the oil and gas out of it. And then the third thing is 3D mapping, so that we could use computer technology, satellite technology, so we have a much better sense of where the energy is. So those three things added together means that the United States, having gone from a period in the Obama administration where President Obama was talking about peak oil, the world was running out of oil, to today, wow, the United States has reserves much more than we ever thought we would have, and that we essentially have enough reserves to power the entire world for hundreds of years, just the United States oil and natural gas alone. So that gives us a couple of things happen as a result of that. Number one, it means that we're not only energy independent, we don't need to rely on other countries' energy, but we're energy dominant, which means that we, the United States, can probably set the price of energy globally, because we can extract oil and natural gas out of these rocks, and our rocks are the best of anybody's in the world, cheaper, safer, better than just about any country can deliver energy, so that the United States could, with supply and demand, simple supply and demand, really drive the price of oil and natural gas down. Our companies will still make a profit, but other countries, China, I'm thinking particularly of Iran and Russia, they need oil at $100 a barrel to make a profit because it pays for all other aspects of their economy and their society, and we can do it at half that price. So it kind of bankrupts the bad guys, bankrupts our adversaries. It's great for the American economy, and it will also be a major help with remodernizing or remanufacturing or reshoring manufacturing industries to the United States, because if our energy is significantly cheaper than anybody else's, any of our peer competitors, that means our goods can be manufactured cheaper than anybody else's. So it'll be great for the American economy. It's great for our foreign policy because, as I said, our adversaries are at an enormous disadvantage. And frankly, it's better for the planet because as the world needs, with AI and blockchain technologies and increasing quantum computing, the world needs a lot more energy than even we have today. And if the United States is in a position to provide that extra energy through oil and natural, I mean, not oil as much, but natural gas. Natural gas is cleaner than oil, it's cleaner than coal, and it's probably better for the environment than anything else. Now, maybe someday we'll have renewable energy sources, but the infrastructure won't be there for 5, 10, 20 years.
So it sounds like energy independence is a primary difference in dynamic between, for example, Europe and the United States. I know that the Trump administration has taken a very different tact in their relations with Europe. Europe has made, some might argue, some long-term strategic errors in prioritizing a different energy mix and with their sort of green agenda. Do you see that as coming back to haunt Europe, and how do you think Europe is going to deal with that in the context of their posture with Russia?
Yeah, so I think the Europeans, especially the Germans, made a big mistake 10 years ago or so when they said two things. One, they're going to go for, eliminating fossil fuels with no real alternative in place. You can't just eliminate fossil fuels. Electricity doesn't just come when you plug it in the wall. It's not manufactured in the wall. It's manufactured somehow, whether it's oil or gas or coal or wind or solar or nuclear. And the Europeans, a lot of them just made these declarations that they would they would eliminate their fossil fuels, but with no really clear idea of what they were going to do to substitute for them. The other thing the Europeans, I think, made a big mistake on was that, especially led by Germany, was to say to the Russians, we'll import your natural gas on all these different pipelines, gas pipelines. And that's how we're going to keep the peace between us, is we'll have an economic relationship. You'll buy our goods, we'll buy your natural gas. We don't need to have a big military because, after all, we're not ever going to go to war. So the Germans demilitarized. The military-industrial base in Europe has fallen off in the last 15 or 20 years. So that assumption that somehow Russia was going to be tamed because it was selling oil and natural gas to the European didn't turn out to be the case. Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia invaded Georgia, Russia took Crimea. So that, again, was a kind of a short-sighted or a bad decision, because now, as Russia has invaded Ukraine And the Europeans are all of a sudden waking up to, yikes, this is a real threat to us. Woo, we've got to scramble. And most of the European countries were not devoting enough of their GNP or their resources to defense, national security. And at the same time, they were letting their defense indices atrophy. And that, you don't make that up overnight. That gets, takes years to build that back up.
Yeah, I mean, and to that point, I mean, obviously the Merz government in Germany has been making a lot of noise about repealing many of the legislation that's in place to limit their fiscal expansion in order to make these strategic investments. Do you think strategic autonomy is a realistic objective for Europe at this time?
Well, I think the Germans, they've had the wake-up call, and they are going to have to do legal and constitutional changes because they have to have a balanced budget. And for them to spend a lot of money on defense means they'd have to borrow they would go into deficit. So they got to fix that. And when the German chancellor says we have to be independent, we have to protect our own selves, President Trump has said, and every president by this, not just Trump, it goes all the way, Obama called the European allies, what did he call, freeloaders. And then if you go back to John F. Kennedy said, wait a minute, you guys are taking a free ride on our defense. So every American president has said to our European allies, come on, ante up, you've got the money, you should pay more for our common defense. And in a way that it's been interpreted when Trump has said to our European allies, hey, if you don't pay up, why should we defend you when you won't defend yourselves, when you could afford to, and in fact, in the case of Germany and others, when in fact you're making the adversary rich because you're buying Russian natural gas. So you're giving money to Russia, and yet you want us to come and defend you against Russia. And so I think the attitude is to get the Europeans to wake up and to start contributing more to our common defense. And if what it takes is to shake somebody by the lapels and say, look, if you don't ante up and you don't do your fair share, which you can afford to do, then maybe we should get out of here. And so, no, I don't think that the United States wants to pull out of NATO, but the United States does want the NATO allies in Europe to start shouldering more of the defense burden.
How do you think Europe is viewing President Trump's position on a Ukraine peace?
Well, we're in the middle of negotiations, so I'm sure that whatever you and I say today in 12 hours will be overtaken by events. But when the French president and the British prime minister came to see President Trump and talk about Ukraine and what would the U.S. contribution be going forward, how do you get to peace, both of those leaders kept talking about something called security guarantees, and that's kind of code word for boots on the ground, a military guarantee. So the attitude had been in the previous American administration, and from a lot of Europeans, and even from Zelensky himself, you can't really trust Putin to keep an agreement. So therefore, don't bother to have a negotiation because he'll never keep it. So it was like they would go around in a circle. Well, therefore, we're not going to negotiate because we can't trust him, so we're going to keep fighting. But you can't keep fighting because Ukraine is slowly, grindingly, horribly losing this war. It's a war of attrition. But at the same time, there's no plan for ending this war. And that's when Trump came in with the overwhelming support of the American people to end the war in Ukraine. I think that there will be an agreement. When the Europeans talked to President Trump, they all talked about how such an agreement would be enforced. The Germans and the French talked about maybe they would put boots on the ground. President Trump made it very clear, no American boots on the ground. But then, I think very brilliantly, President Trump took a suggestion that Zelensky had kind of made as an offhand suggestion and said, well, maybe what we do here is that we, the United States, co-invest with the Ukrainians to develop their rare earth minerals, which are on the eastern side of Ukraine. U.S. needs rare earth minerals. We don't have much of it. China has a lot of rare earth minerals. Ukraine probably has a lot. So that the U.S. could go in with Ukraine and develop those rare earth minerals. It'd be great for the Ukrainian economy, it'd be great for the Americans because we could feel that we were getting some of the money back that we've invested in Ukraine. And it would tie the United States and Ukrainian economies closely together. I mean, if we're going to invest, and we're talking about, who knows, $500 billion of trade investment, the United States is with Ukraine for the long run. And so the way I look at it is, and again, I don't speak for President Trump, but I'm familiar with his thinking, is that the United States is not going to say that Ukraine should join NATO. That's like World War III. The United States is not going to get involved in military boots on the ground. But if the United States puts in engineers and miners and project managers and probably lawyers and bankers in significant presence in eastern Ukraine, that is an implicit guarantee of our interest in your sovereignty for a decade, not just for a decade, but for a generation. And if you're Vladimir Putin saying, I just can't wait to invade anybody I can think of, no way Vladimir Putin is going to kill thousands of Americans on his way to Kyiv. So having American, combat boots on the ground, like fighter combat boots, is not the same as having workman boots on the ground. But I do think it is an elegant solution, an economic and trade solution to how do we help guarantee Ukraine's security, but at the same time without having to go to war to do it.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually that's a very astute or interesting insight that I hadn't heard articulated like that. Shifting to the Middle East, I mean, obviously the Israeli-Gaza situation doesn't seem to be getting any less complicated. President Trump has made what some might say are unusual proposals about how to deal with that situation. How would you characterize his position?
You can't keep doing what we've been doing, where there's a war, Gaza's destroyed, they rebuild on the rubble, Hamas continues, they rearm, they go at it again, another round and another round. So right now, several things have happened. Israel has just pretty much destroyed Hamas, taken out the Syrian air defenses for Iran. So Iran doesn't have defenses against any kind of aerial attack. And then Hezbollah, another terrorist group threatening Israel, has been decimated. So it leaves Iran in a more vulnerable position than ever before. And with Trump reimposing economic sanctions on Iran and oil sanctions on Iran, and with Trump's energy policy, which is already starting to drive down the price of oil, and Iran, the whole economy rests on its ability to export oil at a high price. So that Iran is going to be feeling the pinch economically because it's not going to have the revenues from its oil exports. It's going to feel the pinch with security because it doesn't have those proxies of Hezbollah, Hamas, PLO, Syria, kind of as the forward defense against any attack that anyone might levy against Iran. But at the same time, if you look at Gaza, so what does that mean with Gaza? Well, maybe Hamas isn't going to be resupplied because maybe Iran can't do it. And when you look at the situation now, people who've been on the ground in Gaza say 90% of the buildings in Gaza are now rubble. And unemployment is 90%. So there's nothing there. So what do you rebuild? If you rebuild on the rubble, you still don't have jobs for these people. You still don't have self-governance. So when Trump has said, well, let's move everybody out, let's move the 2 million Palestinians out, let's rebuild, let's just plow it, get rid of the rubble and rebuild it to, he says the Mediterranean of the Arab world. Or maybe what it is that you rebuild it in the sense that it is a repurposed country. Right now, there's no industry in Gaza. But if there was a hospitality industry, there was a construction industry, then maybe you could have jobs for the Palestinians. And if you could move them out temporarily, and then in some kind of way, as people re-enter that terror, that Palestinians would re-enter, you could vet them and make sure that who's coming back in is not Hamas. Because otherwise, if you just leave it the way it is, Hamas comes back again. I mean, unless Hamas is completely finished and they're all dead, the Hamas fighters, Hamas will come again because there's nothing else. So I think that when President Trump said that, it was again, take him seriously, but don't take him literally. But he's saying, okay, if you guys don't like that idea, come up with your own. And the Arab countries, the Gulf Arabs, have said, well, that's interesting, maybe that's not our idea, but we will come up with another solution. So Trump very much wants the local countries, whether it's in Ukraine, the countries surrounding Ukraine, or whether it's the Arab countries surrounding in the Middle East, you guys, this is your neighborhood. You're the best ones to help rebuild it. You've got the money to help do it. And so if you don't like my idea, come up with something else. But at least it's thinking outside the box.
Yeah, for sure. Katy, I want to make sure that we touch on China and your thoughts on us here in the Caribbean and Cayman Islands. On China, I mean, obviously, China's position as a global economic power has only expanded over the last decade. It seems like President Trump has a relatively cooperative posture towards China? I mean, obviously there's been talks and imposition of tariffs. How do you see the relationship with China evolving over the next 4 years?
You know, when people talk about tariffs and free trade, they don't really understand what the current situation is. So, for example, in 2000, when China joined the World WTO, World Trade Organization, we, the United States especially, said to China, okay, your goods, you can make your goods, you can sell them into our country, and we'll charge very little tariff, very little tax on your goods. Meanwhile, we can make our goods in our country, and we're going to give you the ability to charge really big tariffs on our goods. So in other words, that's going to give you the breathing space to develop your economy. And the thought by both Republicans and Democrats at the time was if you could help China become a modern economy, a modern society, that they would, like our former adversaries in World War II, as we did with Germany, as we did with Japan. If you could help them build their economies, build a middle class, build their societies, that then they would become trading partners and we wouldn't go to war with each other. And that was the attitude toward China. The attitude was that, well, maybe China could become like Germany or Japan, that China would have as they became more prosperous, they would open their economy, they would open their society, and we could trade together. Sadly, that was never China's plan. And so while we helped them economically develop, they had very different designs. And as we've seen in the last, 6, 8 years, that the Chinese are looking at Russia and some kind of a Sino-Russian alliance that is targeted and aimed at the United States. And that is a strategic threat existential threat to the United States, because if you had Chinese technology, Chinese money, married up with Russian natural resources and Russian military, aimed at the United States, that is a real threat to our very existence. So when President Trump, I think, he or any Americans now, there's a growing recognition in the United States that China is an adversary and is looking out for their best interests at the expense of our interests. That how do you deal with China going forward? Well, Trump understands that fundamental thing, that China needs to sell to us more than we need to buy from China. So maybe we use tariffs as a way to getting to fair tariffs or reciprocal tariffs, not this imbalanced tariff that we have now, but a balanced tariff. Maybe we use the threat of tariffs or preventing China from coming into the American market as a way of getting other cooperation that we want on other issues. I think one of the reasons that President Trump has looked at Ukraine as a situation where let's get that darn war over as fast as we can, not only because who wants people to die, but is there any way that the United States, which has had no relations with Russia, we have not talked to the Russians for 3.5 years. I mean, we don't even talk about it at the passport level. So is there a way for us to talk to Russia after the fighting stops in Ukraine in such a way that maybe we could have a relationship with Russia that may be able to pull them away or drive a wedge between this Sino-Russia alliance?
How big a flashpoint do you think President Trump views Taiwan?
Well, Taiwan is the most important issue I think President Trump is going to face in his presidency. I think Ukraine is important, Russia is important, Iran, Middle East is important. But the real important one, the one that's going to threaten everything, is Taiwan. China looks at Taiwan and says it wants Taiwan. And Xi Jinping has said, we want Taiwan and I want it in my lifetime. And I'm in my early 70s, so you can do the math. He's looking at a very short time period that he wants to annex Taiwan. And it's really for 3 reasons. I mean, one, China, from their perspective, the Chinese look at Taiwan and say, wait, they speak Chinese, they're ethnically Chinese, they're ours. And we want them back. But there are other reasons that they don't like to talk about, but are probably even more important, which is if China were to control Taiwan, militarily control Taiwan, China could control that whole Western Pacific. The world's most important maritime trade route, right, is from the Middle East, Europe, into Asia. Not just into China, but into all of Asia. Mm-hmm. And if China has the guns on Taiwan, it can control who goes in and out of that trade route. But the other reason is because of the chips, the microprocessing chips. 80% of the microprocessing chips, not the most advanced ones, but the ones that run everything, are manufactured in Taiwan. And if China gets hold of that part of the global economic infrastructure, That could be an enormous advantage for China, and it would really be bad, not just for the United States, but everybody else. So when the U.S. looks at Taiwan, it's not just looking at Taiwan from the perspective, it's looking at it from an economic and a strategic and a military perspective. How we go forward, I don't know. I mean, this will be one of the things that President Trump will have to face one way or the other. But I can tell you, he's a deal guy, and he uses economic leverage and economic power. And when he doesn't reach for the military weapon as quickly as presidents have in the past. He'll have it if he needs to use it, but his instincts will always be, can we do a trade deal? Can we do an economic deal? Can we invest in each other's countries? But he also believes in protecting, helping our allies to, I don't know, maybe thrive, survive, whatever word you want to use. But that will be the tough one. Taiwan will be the tough one.
Katy, lastly, obviously President Trump has been making a lot of waves economically, both on the fiscal front, on the taxes. The Cayman Islands are largely a financially oriented economy. Mm-hmm. How do you think Trump's policies might affect us here in Cayman Islands?
Well, if the United States does have this new golden age that Trump talks about because of our economic, all the reasons that I've said, because of energy, he'll cut taxes, we'll have economic growth, our adversaries are not growing like we are, even our peer competitors are not growing like we are. So the United States could be looking at a decade of great prosperity. Obviously that has an effect on all of our near neighbors and friends, certainly someplace like the Caymans. But the other thing is, as we, the United States, look at what we now call the Gulf of America, that used to be called the Gulf of Mexico, and we look at the Caribbean, one of the things that's really important to the United States is that no enemy sets up shop in the Caribbean. No enemy uses Caribbean ports as military ports that would threaten the United States. So I think that we look very closely at that. We want to keep our friends close, and we don't necessarily want to keep our adversaries in the same neighborhood.
Katy, thank you so much for your time. What amazing wisdom you have to share with us today. And on behalf of Cayman and the CFA Society of Cayman Islands, hope you enjoy the rest of your stay.
Oh, it's magnificent. Thank you so much.
You've just been listening to Money Sense right here at Radio Cayman. We're just about 4 minutes away from the 8 o'clock hour. This time check brought to you by our friends at Foster's.
When you're on the go, the experience